Back in episode 1, we previously learned that Plato inherited the story of Atlantis from Solon, who was told the tale by Egyptian priests. This was approximately 200 years prior to the writing of Plato's dialogues. Crantor, who was born only a few years after the death of Plato, attested that the story of Atlantis could still be found on pillars in Egypt. Unfortunately, these pillars are nowhere to be found in our modern era. It's likely that they were either destroyed or recycled by later peoples. So apart from Plato's dialogues, and the now non-existent pillars, are there any traces of the Atlantis story remaining in Egypt? Enter the Temple of Horus. The Temple of Horus can be located approximately 600 kilometers due south of Cairo, in the Egyptian city of Edfu. Edfu is situated on the west bank of the Nile, between Esna and Aswan. The present-day temple is an artifact of the Ptolemaic kingdom, although it should be noted that it was built on the site of an earlier temple which was also dedicated to Horus. Construction began on August the 23rd, 237 BCE, during the reign of Ptolemy III. Amazingly, the temple wasn't completed until 180 years later, in the year 57 BCE. This was during the reign of Ptolemy XII. The inner and outer walls of the temple are covered with inscriptions. These inscriptions are extensive and provide detailed instructions on how to construct temples of appropriate proportions. The inscriptions also tell stories regarding creation and the age-old conflict between Horus and Seth. We are only concerned about the inscriptions that mirror Plato's Atlantis. Even this part alone is fairly extensive and difficult to translate. The various translations that are freely available have some deviation between one another, hence I will be telling the story found at Edfu as an abbreviated summary. I will almost certainly revisit the story in more detail in a future video, but for this we will have to wait for Dieter Kurth and his team at the Göttingen Academy of Sciences and Humanities to upload the most accurate translations to the Edfu databank. They have already uploaded volumes 7 and 8. The volume that we're concerned with is volume 6. The volume numbers refer to Emil Chassenat's original copies of the Edfu texts that he painstakingly copied over 40 years. Copies of Chassenat's volumes can be found for free on various internet archives. For the time being, I will be borrowing heavily from these two books. The first book is Atlantis, Egyptian Genesis, authored by Ian Driscoll and Matthew Kurtz. The second book is The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple by Eve Ann Elizabeth Raymond. Now without further ado, let us tell the tale of the Island of Trampling. This story begins long ago, at some undefined mythical point in time named by the ancient Egyptians as the early primeval age. It was during this time, in the midst of the primeval waters, that unknown forces fertilized the embryo of the earth. The subsequent result of this fertilization was the emergence of a muddy island that was in part covered with reeds. This island was said to be the original nucleus of the world. It was referred to as the province of the beginning, or the island of the egg. The first event to occur after the emergence was the acquisition of physical form by the unknown forces responsible for the island's appearance. They begat themselves without mother or father. This first divine generation were referred to by the ancient Egyptians as the primeval ones. The last of the primeval ones to take form was the sun god, whom after initiating the radiance of the first occasion is said to have come forth from the great lotus that emerged from the pool. This pool was the most sacred and prominent feature of the island, where the primeval ones were said to have resided within its vicinity. Another notable feature of this island was a field of reeds. It was here that the domain of the Djed pillars was located. These Djed pillars were fashioned from reeds and were said to be the seat or seats of the gods. This same domain was the location of a mound or high hill. The primeval ones made this island their home. They went about their creative tasks as life developed within this place over many years. But this wasn't to last forever. It appears as if a fight of some kind took place within the island. It was such a notable event that the texts no longer refer to this sacred place as the Island of the Egg. It is now referred to as the Island of the Aggression, the Island of the Combat, the Island of Trampling. Was this some internal conflict, or were the primeval ones at war with some external aggressor? Details of this era are scant, so perhaps we will never know. What we do know, however, is that this era ended in disaster, a cataclysm caused by the enemy snake, the Great Leaping One. Something or some concept going by the name of the Sound Eye fell. The island domain split, and was then submerged in the primeval waters by a storm. The primeval inhabitants perished, and the remnants of this sacred domain were covered in darkness. Now this is far from the end of the story at Edfu, but this is probably a good place to stop for now, as this seems to be about where Plato's Atlantis story comes to an abrupt end, either due to it being incomplete or perhaps the rest of the dialogue of Critias remains lost to us. You'll notice that so far the Edfu version doesn't have anywhere near the level of detail that Plato provided in his Atlantis story. Raymond makes it a point that the inscriptions found at Edfu are abbreviated versions of earlier source documents. The portion of the Edfu story that we just covered looks like it originally came from the sacred book of the early primeval age of gods. Could this sacred book be the original source of the story that was told to Solon by the Egyptian priests? Who knows what other details and curiosities have been lost to us with the disappearance of this book? Another point that is raised by Raymond is that this part of the Edfu text refers to many of the creative powers as unnamed forces. There are similar stories, such as the Heliopolitan and Memphite theories that attribute creation to well-known physical deities. This could indicate that the sacred book of the early primeval age of gods is a truly ancient pre-dynastic document. Later in the video, I will very briefly provide a synopsis on the rest of the story, the part that seems to be missing from Plato's Critias, that is, if these two stories are actually related. But for now, let's analyse what we have so far. The story starts by telling us that unknown forces fertilise the embryo of the Earth. This is fascinating, as I have recently learned about Large Low Shear Velocity Provinces, or LLSVPs. At this point, I would like to thank C. Smith from the Graham Hancock message board for alerting me to the existence of LLSVPs. I will be talking about this subject in more detail in a future video. A video that will act as a kind of update to the geological information found in episode 4. In the meantime, we can say that an LLSVP is an inconsistency in the deep mantle made from denser, more radioactive material than the surrounding mantle. This material then goes on to form superplumes. There is one under the Pacific Ocean and one under the African continent. There is an offshoot from the African superplume that is located under the Atlantic Ocean. These superplumes seem to be responsible for the large amount of basalt found at the mid-ocean ridges of the Atlantic and Pacific. I believe it's well accepted that the African superplume is responsible for the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. If you remember back to episode 4, we know that the present-day Azores would have been located right at the centre of Pangaea and right where Pangaea began to break apart. This harkens back to the Edfu story describing the Island of the Egg as the original nucleus of the world. The radioactive component of the LLSVPs might also explain why the Azores hotspot goes into periods of high and low activity due to the changing convection dynamics as the system strives towards equilibrium. Now there are two main mechanisms proposed for the origin of LLSVPs. One of them is that they are the remains of Theia, the smaller, denser planet that supposedly collided with the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. The subsequent result was the formation of the Moon from the debris of the impact. This event does seem to conjure up images of a cosmic fertilization event, akin to the fertilization of an egg. Now let's not go all in on this idea. If this is what the story is truly trying to convey to us, then it would mean that a Stone Age people would have acquired an advanced knowledge of both geology and orbital mechanics. Maybe this is too much of a stretch, but I don't think it's impossible. At the end of the day, orbital mechanics is just advanced mathematics. Advanced technology isn't essential to its existence, but it would certainly help. We next learn that the fertilization event is responsible for the emergence of a muddy island in the midst of the primeval waters. This emergence would certainly tie up with the hypothesis from Ghent et al. Explaining how the Azores hotspot goes through periods of episodic activity that I believe could be responsible for the emersion of the Azores plateau every 3 to 5 million years. Continuing with the story, we are told that the original inhabitants begat themselves without mother or father. Rather than taking this at face value and assuming that this implies some kind of paranormal phenomenon, perhaps this could mean that these people civilized themselves, a proto-civilization that is not the result of an earlier ancestor civilization. In contrast, our modern Western civilizations are born from the various influences of earlier ancient European and Middle Eastern civilizations that came before us. Now, what about the fall of the Sound Eye? There is so little context regarding this part of the story that any speculation feels like we're grasping at straws as to its explanation. Was the Sound Eye a non-physical concept? Or could it be some man-made physical object or monument that fell as a result of the cataclysm? Maybe this Sound Eye was the cause of the cataclysm, perhaps representing an asteroid or comet. Much like Plato's story, this era ends with a fight or war, followed by a cataclysm and the submergence of the island. It could just be a coincidence, but the similarities are uncanny, especially as Egypt was the source for Plato's story, via Solon of course. Perhaps Solon, or even Plato, projected the Proto-Athenian warriors into their own story to glorify the Hellenic peoples. The final point I'd like to make before we move on is with regards to the enemy serpent, the Great Leaping One. Did this simply represent the enemy forces that fought at the island of Trampling? Or did this represent the forces of the cataclysm? I previously speculated that the Sound Eye could represent a falling asteroid or comet. Might the enemy serpent represent the source, the Draconid meteor shower, for example? As I said earlier, I will now very briefly provide a synopsis on the rest of the events that followed the cataclysm. Before we start, I should probably mention that the stories found at Edfu don't seem to provide clear timeframes regarding the various events that took place. It appears as if the submerged island remained covered in darkness for quite some time. Eventually, the primeval waters grew radiant, and the sun, once again, shone on the island, thus marking a new era. It was then that a new generation of inhabitants emerged from the sacred pool. They found what remained of the domain of the Jed Pillars, only now it was partially submerged. The new inhabitants saw only the reeds on the surface of the water. The reeds formed a small island in this most sacred of places. The new inhabitants set about restoring this domain to honour the primeval ones who came before them. Their first act was to erect a slip of reed from the same material from which the Jed Pillars were formerly constructed. This slip of reed was to become the Jebba, or perch for the winged one, the falcon god. The second act was to restore the secondary lands from beneath the water that would come to surround the island of reeds. Uttering spells, the water receded to reveal the land that once surrounded the field of reeds. Further utterances caused the water to recede further still to reveal additional lands that were once held sacred to the primeval ones. The third act was the emergence of the Great Primeval Mound. Sometime later, the enemy snake returned, only this time he was overthrown by the falcon god. A new era of creation is born. The new inhabitants build various sacred buildings and temples. Supporters of the falcon god arrive and settle on the island, while some of the more creative inhabitants responsible for the new generation of sacred buildings depart and head off to distant lands. As I said, this is a very brief synopsis. For anybody who is interested, it's worth getting hold of Raymond's book to look at the Edfu texts in their original contexts. Raymond thoroughly deconstructs the Edfu texts, and it should be said that no reference is made with regards to Atlantis in her book. It looks like the book has been out of print for quite some time, but many universities and colleges seem to have a copy in their libraries. At the start of my synopsis, we discover that the primeval waters grew radiant before the re-emergence of the island. Could this indicate that the Azores hotspot was still in a period of high activity, the magma below the crust causing the island to partially lift back out from under the ocean once more? Now I want to propose an idea regarding the reeds, jed pillars and Jebba perch. It could very well be that the reeds are exactly that, just simple organic reeds, but to me they don't seem to be the ideal material for constructing pillars, thrones, supports and other structures. A single slip of reed is hardly going to make a suitable throne for a person, let alone a god. For my proposal, we can find a clue in Kurtz and Driscoll's book. Their book includes a number of creation stories found all around the world that draw very close parallels to the Edfu and Atlantis creation stories. One of the Hindu creation stories tells of the island of Bindu, located in the middle of the abysmal waters of the Great Ocean. Bindu, otherwise known as the Drop, is the first drop which spreads, unfolds and expands. I don't want to tell the whole story in this video, that will come in due time. There's a specific detail from this story that can help us out here. The throne of the great goddess Maya is said to be hexagonal. Now what does the Azores have in great abundance that looks like a tightly packed bundle of reeds that would also make for an extremely durable building material? If you haven't guessed already, the Azores has an abundance of hexagonal basalt columns. Basalt is denser than granite and only marginally lower in hardness. Basalt columns are easily quarried. We quarry basalt columns today to make ornamental garden features, for example. This is done by splitting individual columns off from the main cluster, far easier than quarrying granite out of bedrock, then shaping it either by hand or possibly by machine. The Edfu texts explain that the Jebba perch was split from one of the original relics of the primeval ones, possibly from one of the fallen jed pillars, which were made from tightly packed bundles of reeds. The very term jed connotes endurance, strength, and stability, things you would associate with rock as opposed to organic reeds. One of the Azores' most famous landmarks is the Rocha dos Bordões basalt columns. The local authorities even go to the effort of keeping them clean by removing moss and other detritus from their surfaces. I've recently discovered that the Rocha dos Bordões basalt columns are located a mere 600 meters from the third corner of the triangle I projected from Göbekli Tepe and Giza in the previous episode. What an interesting coincidence. I appreciate that this proposal of mine is just conjecture, but I think it's worth considering. If we dig into the story of the second period of creation a little deeper, we can start to find details that are missing from the first period of creation. Here we have an artist's impression of the layout of the sacred domain of the island after it had been restored by the second generation of inhabitants. This comes directly from Kurtz and Driscoll's book. You can clearly see the resemblance to Plato's lost city of Atlantis. I would argue that the center region is the field of reeds, possibly a large matrix of basalt columns. If we take a look at the gravity map of my proposed location for the lost city, we can see that relative to the surrounding plane, the gravity here is significantly greater. This could suggest that my proposed location for the city is made from basalt, which would be approximately 10% higher in density than the surrounding continental type crust. Looking back at the layout of the sacred domain, we can see the falcon god perched atop the Jebba. Now the secondary lands are described as being adjacent to the sacred domain of the falcon god. They're not described as concentric, but Kurtz and Driscoll make it clear that the secondary lands are in close proximity and they clearly surround the central island. They justify it further by declaring that numerous world mythologies describe the first island of creation as being surrounded by smaller islands. There are further similarities between the Edfu story and Plato's story, but it's more appropriate to share them in a later video where I will present them alongside some of the other world creation mythologies that resemble Atlantis or the Island of the Egg. Some of these can be found in Kurtz and Driscoll's book. Unlike Raymond's book, this one is still in print and it is also readily available on Kindle. I urge anyone who is interested in Atlantis, or just the possibility that there is some link between various cultures from around the world, to buy this book. I should say that this is not a paid advertisement. I would like to thank Matt Simpson from the Ancient Architects channel for giving my previous video a shout out on Twitter. He single-handedly boosted my subscriber count from 99 to well over 800 people.